Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to see you all today. Although good afternoon, good evening for some of you, I believe. Welcome to our second webinar on the topic of semi-diplomatic transcriptions. Today, we're going to be talking about the basics of style. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We're very lucky to be living and working here. Let's also go through what our learning objectives are. There are quite a few things that you'll be picking up today, which will help set you up for success in our future webinars as well, because August, we're also going to be talking about semi-diplomatic transcriptions, just some more advanced topics in them. But today, you're going to know what CSS and SCSS are and what those initialisms stand for, which is key to getting an understanding of our style. You're also going to have an understanding of Lemdo's underlying principles for styling semi-diplomatic transcriptions. And for those of you who were at our webinar on sustainability, you might recognize them from the endings principles that we talked about. You're also going to know what our levels of style at Lemdo are. So we've got 3, the generic level, the file-wide level, and the inline level. You're going to be able to look at Lemdo's style sheet, though you will have a more thorough understanding of it after our August styling webinar. So look for that coming up on August 22nd. You're going to be able to update your own file-wide styling using the tags-decal element. And you'll be able to use the correct syntax for inline styling using the rendition attribute and using the place attribute. And the place attribute is going to be using things from our placement taxonomy. For those of you who are actively working on your semi-diplomatic transcriptions and who have access to the repo, you know how to work in there, you've done a test commit with me in the past, you'll also get the opportunity to add file-wide styling using the tags-decal element. So, getting started with the basics. What is CSS? It's the language that we use to style our HTML web pages. So any Lemdo site, any site that looks nice was made to look nice using CSS. It's just the language that we use. It stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And that means that in kind of very basic theory, our style trickles down from our big greedy generic file, and that goes down to all of the encoding that could encompass. In the Lemdo ecosystem, we've got our 3 levels. So we've got our site-wide style, that's our big greedy style, and that's our SCSS. Then we have a file-wide style, which is slightly less greedy, and that applies to your entire semi-diplomatic transcription. That's our tags-decal. And then we have our inline style, which we can do with style or with a couple of other things. We'll talk more about the details of what those are in just a second, and then a couple other things as well. And Mihaela, I see things in the chat.
Yes, we have a question in the chat from Heidi. What do you mean by greedy?
Greedy. I mean that they're styling lots and lots of things. So you could have a piece of style in there that says style paragraphs to be indented on the first line, and that would apply to everything in Lemdo. And that's pretty greedy to apply to all of those different files. Does that kind of make sense?
Thank you.
All right. Yeah. So in addition to the style kind of trickling down or cascading down from our generic to our file wide to our inline style, we can override those. So when you get down to that inline style, you can override things from the previous style. So although you could say every paragraph in Lemdo should be indented one, you might say in your tags decal that actually for this file, I don't want every paragraph indented, and that will override. And so the more specific we get, that takes precedence. And more specific location-wise. So when it's in that faraway file, it's considered not specific. When it's in the file itself, it's considered more specific. And when it's on the exact line that you want to be indented or italicized, that's the most specific that you can get. And so that takes precedence over anything else you've said earlier on. And that includes within a single file. So in our big SCSS file that applies to all of Lemdo, if we put something that's more precise, here we've got stage type equals exit, and this is HTML. Sorry, that's what SCSS works on, so that's what I've put here. If we have, actually, no, this is TEI, never mind. I'm not going to apologize, this is TEI. We have stage type equals exit. That's more specific than just stage. You know, we've put in an attribute, so we're saying we only want this to apply to exits. And so if we've got stage text align equals center, or stage type equals exit and text align is right, well, anything that's an exit is going to be to the right, not to the center, because this is more specific. It also is things that are lower down on the page are considered more specific. So if we had stage text align is center, as we do, and then stage text align is right, well, what gets processed? The second one. The lower down on the page it is, the more precise it's considered, which is a little bit funny in my mind. And what all of that means to you right now is just this. When you encode your semi-diplomatic transcription, our processing turns your TEI XML into HTML. HTML comes with its own basic styling that somebody somewhere once upon a time added. And it looks like what's on the screen right now. This is one of our title pages with all of the styling removed. Everything is more or less aligned left, with a couple of exceptions because these are technically images. Some things are bolded, some things are not bolded. Links are this blue color that you see a lot online. If I were to click one, it would turn purple. We don't have any of our special styling like italicization or anything like that. And it's not the most beautiful thing. It's functional, it's fine, but it's not what we want. So we write some CSS, some styling. And that makes our pages pretty. This is what the title page actually looks like on our website with our styling in place. I've written some of it. Our designer, Pat, has written some of it. For the semi-diplomatic transcriptions, that is. For everything else, Pat wrote most of it. And so for our title pages, we've said, okay, well, everything should be centered. We want this nice little black border around it. We don't want anything to be bold unless we say this thing should be bold. We want things to be italicized. We want to have features like letter spacing to kind of mimic what we see on early modern pages. And we don't want that blue color. We want just a blue underline, and it's our nice light Lemdo blue, not that really bold HTML blue. So that's what happens is you have your TEI, it gets turned by our processor into HTML. We add in the CSS that we've written, and bam, we have a beautiful page. And that gets done at our 3 levels, starting with our SCSS. So SCSS, which I'll say SCSS sometimes, or I'll just say SAS. I'm talking about the same thing. It stands for Sassy Cascading Style Sheets, which I personally love as a name. And SAS also stands for something. It stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. So we've got, syntactically awesome style sheets, cascading style sheets. But I don't know, they're fun. Anyhow, all that SAS is an extension of CSS. Really what matters to know about it is that it makes it easy for us to group together style for specific things. So we can group together all of our style for semi-diplomatic transcriptions. It lives in its own file, and everything in there can be nested so that it's really tidy and organized. Plain old CSS really recently has started allowing you to do that to an extent, but it didn't used to. So we've been using SAS, and it generally works quite well for us. But our little semi-diplomatic file does get included in our big Lemdo dev SAS file, kind of as it gets processed. So those were some new terms, new ideas for people. We'll go more into them, later on and also in August. But if there are any questions right now, or especially about the terminology itself, I'm happy to take any of those if they're coming in. Okay, let's move into principles of style in that case. So, and I see something's coming on the chat.
Yeah, one more question. Are SAS and SCSS the same thing?
Yes, there are some slight differences technically, but they're the same thing. They're just like two generations almost. Is my understanding, although I'm sure that, if you go onto the SAS website, it'll give you a better answer than yes, more or less.
Okay, there's a thank you too.
Perfect. So our styling principles are really based on and coming out of our principles for endings compliance, which were developed over at UVic's Humanities Computing and Media Center to help make sure that humanities sites are as long lasting as possible. If you weren't there a few weeks ago when Janelle was talking about endings compliance, one of the things that's really come up over the past 20 years is so many of our digital humanities sites just kind of disappear, because they're not designed and created in a way that is, made for longevity. And so this endings project was kind of formulated to help make sure that our digital humanities sites are long lasting and that your work stays up for as long as it possibly can. And so we're using their principles in all of our Lemdo practice, including in our style. And the two that we think about for style are 4.6 and 4.7. So 4.6, massive redundancy. Every page contains all the components it needs so that it will function without the rest of the site if necessary, even though doing so means duplicating information across the site. And then also graceful failure. Every page should still function effectively, even in the absence of JavaScript or CSS support. So we looked at that HTML page with no styling before. That's what it would look like with no CSS. It functions. It's not perfect appearance-wise, but it works just fine. And massive redundancy means that we want to make sure that all of our information lives with your semi-diplomatic file itself. So what this means for us is, as I said, each file must be able to exist on its own and contain all of the necessary information, which in turn means that no key information about what your source book looks like should live in the SAS file alone. because then the information wouldn't be contained in the file, it would be contained in a different file, which we don't want. Which means that we use our TEI to describe and our CSS to prescribe. If something, if what something looks like isn't somehow captured in our TEI files for semi-diplomatic transcriptions, it shouldn't be in the SAS file. And we're kind of going through and sorry, it's smoky here, so you can probably hear it in my voice. We're going through, we've got a few things that weren't captured in our TEI that we have done in our SAS, and we're going through to make sure that that doesn't continue happening, because you know, we need to have that in the TEI file. And so we can say that something is aligned to the right in our TEI file, and then we can go in and add the styling for that, no problem. But we don't want to just make up our mind about where things go in the CSS. Other things to keep in mind are, we're not expecting to exactly recreate the mise-en-page of our early modern pages. Our website isn't going to look exactly like an early modern playbook, and that's okay. People have access to the TEI files if they so choose to look at them, where we should be describing everything. And they also have access to facsimile images through Lemdo. So when you work on your semi-diplomatic transcription, you can embed facsimile links, and then people can look at the facsimile and the semi-diplomatic transcription side by side. And people can get a better idea of exactly what's going on the page that way. Second, because CSS cascades, making a high-level change can have a lot of fallout. If, again, you're somebody who's actively working on your semi-diplomatic transcriptions, you've probably noticed a bit of that in the past couple of months on our websites. I've been rearranging things to make them more, simplified and straightforward, which has led to some bugs down the line because they were high-level changes, so that had fallout. And I'm working through those with Pat right now. All right, so those are kind of our basics, our definitions, our principles. Let's talk about actual levels of style. So the first level, as you know, is our SCSS, our site-wide style, and it's our generic style. We, as the Lemdo team, have looked at a lot of old books and determined that generally they look a certain way. The text is generally aligned left. Stage directions are typically italicized. Speech prefixes are indented a bit after you get to a certain period, and so on. And so we can say with confidence, yeah, the text on our website should be aligned left. And then we can describe things to make sure that, that information is captured in the TEI, but also just dealt with in our SCSS. So then we don't need to put the same thing in, a few hundred times. And it deals with our HTML, not our TEI encoding. And it's edited just by the Lemdo team, almost entirely myself and our Lemdo designer, Pat, although we have a few other people who sometimes will pop in.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Thanks for the after a certain period acknowledgement with the apologies from the, a comment on a question with apologies from the wilds of early Tudor drama. So just a comment on how
Yes,
within the same kind of realm.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's where our file-wide styling really comes into play, is because we do know, there was that earlier period where it wasn't that, standard indent. We have stuff in margins, and we have stuff on its own line and all over the place. So yeah. Yeah, so but no, the SAS file is edited by us. You're not going to touch it. And this is what it looks like. So It's in a file called _semi-dip.scss. It lives inside of data, anthologies, lemdo-dev, site, CSS. You can look at it. You can't make changes in it. Please don't try to make changes in it, but you shouldn't be allowed anyhow. And you'll see I've got it open, not in Oxygen, in a different app called Visual Studio Code, because I far prefer that for working in CSS. But it looks a little bit funky. We've got our HTML here. We've got our actual CSS styling, saying what the font family is, what the font size is, what the color is. And it just kind of looks like that. We then have our file-wide style, which is dealt with in your semi-dip file itself, using the tag_style element. So this is for things that are true across your entire semi-diplomatic file that aren't dealt with in the Sass. So if all of your speaker tags are on their own line and centered, Godly Queen Hester, I believe, you can deal with that in the tag_style. And that will apply across everything in your file. It deals with TEI, not HTML, which makes it a little bit of a friendlier starting place for people getting into styling, because it's using a language that you're more familiar with. And you can edit it. We've written what we recommend putting in, because there are a few things that we don't describe anywhere in our TEI files, and so we couldn't put into Sass, like where the formworks are. So we've written an recommended tag_style, but you can take that, copy it into your file, and then do what you wish with it, like changing it to have your speaker in a different place. And this is what our recommended one looks like. So it lives in the encoding desk element, which is in your TEI header at the top of your file. And it's just underneath the editorial decal. So we give our encoding description, we give our editorial declaration, and then we give our tagging declaration, our tag_style. Each thing that you want to style, each element gets its own rendition element, with a selector attribute, which is where you define what you want. This one here is a formwork where the type is running title. You say, I'm using CSS to style this. You always need to use CSS to style this here. And then you can put your actual style. So we recommend aligning your running titles to the center of the page. This specific text had them italic, not all of them do, and it needs to be display block. This makes your signature numbers centered, and this makes your catchwords aligned to the right. And you can find this if you go to our documentation. I'm going to show you this right now because it's useful to be able to do. Go to chapter 12 and find encode file-wide style. And it lives right here. And this is the exact same as what I just showed you. You can copy and paste it into your file, right in that encoding desk after the editorial declaration. And then you're good to go. Finally, we have our inline style. And when I talk about inline style, I'm talking about 3 methods of working. The first is the rendition attribute, then the place attribute, and the style attribute. Each of these goes onto a specific element to make that one thing look a certain way. So if you had just one stage direction that happened to be, in Roman type for whatever reason, or a name halfway through a speech and that name only is an italic, you can use one of these to style just that thing. There are some complexities when we're thinking about specificity with these, which we'll talk about more in August. But today we're going to just kind of introduce them, so then you can use them in your files. The first option we have is the rendition attribute. As I said, these apply to a single element. They can go on any element, but note that you don't really want to use them too much on self-closing elements like LB because they style what's in the text node of the element. So LB is self-closing, there isn't a text node. There's nothing to really make italic because it's just like a carriage return. And they use preform values that Lemdo decided a long time ago, well before my time, that would be useful to have. So italic, for example, or normal font, which just means Roman, and so on like that. And it applies to the full element. So as I said, it goes and styles whatever's in the text node of that element. You'll put it on the smallest possible element that captures everything you want to style. So if a full stage direction is in Roman type, it would go on that stage element because it's the smallest one that captures everything inside of it. And if there isn't one that's small enough, you can add the high element to your text to just wrap around that one specific word or one specific letter or phrase. And this is what it looks like in practice. So in that title page we looked at earlier where London was letter spaced, London is wrapped in the pub place element, which only contains London. It contains everything that I want to be letter spaced and nothing else. So I put in a rendition attribute with an RND colon prefix, always need that, and then the value. These pop up as you're typing, so it's really easy to use. They're pretty straightforward. Here's one where there wasn't an appropriate container element. So there's this one line, as it hath been sundry times publicly, that was italicized. But we don't wrap lines in an element. We have, you know, the line beginning element that's self-closing. And so we need to wrap the line in something, and we use high to do that. So we've got high rendition is RND italic, and that makes it so that this line appears italicized on the website. For placement on the page, we use the place attribute. We use it mostly on stage. We can use them on label. I don't think the style kicks in for those yet, but it will. And as long as your TEI encoding is accurately describing what you have on the page, we're happy. But mostly we use it on stage, and it should be on pretty much every stage element that you have. The only exception is if your entire stage direction is a hung word, which we've seen once or twice in our last, 30 plays that we've worked on. So it should go on almost every single place element or stage element. And we have a robust taxonomy of values here. This image is a page from Hamlet. You can see it on the Lemdo documentation site. In chapter 3 of our documentation, chapter 3, we've got a page called Placement Taxonomy. I'm also going to show you a little demo in a second, but our placement taxonomy documentation has this image, a few other images just pointing to what we mean when we talk about all of these spaces. And it gives definitions for each of these things in both English and French. And so, you know, go and consult that when you're trying to think about where something is on the page. But I'm going to take a second and show you the this thing right here. Make it full screen. Just a little like slide show of what these look like and how we're using these terms, because I find that this is where we get a lot of questions and some missteps in our encoding, is just saying where things are on the page. So I've made this handy little guide. This is a page. Here it is. This is a early modern page, clearly. Oh, it's just a little white rectangle. I've added a brown line. It represents our text block. So this is where the text goes on our plate. These little purple areas on the tops and the bottoms, there are formworks areas. And then here we have our margins on the right and the left. In our placement taxonomy, we describe the formwork areas as being top. So up here where we have typically our running title, if there's a page number, it usually goes up here. That's top. The bottom is where we have our signature number and our catchword. And then we have 3 descriptors for kind of our horizontal placement. And you'll see that they're, you know, a range rather than exactly aligned, because things aren't always exactly aligned in our early modern playbooks, are they? They're kind of a little bit all over the place to an extent. But we have in this kind of purple color, the left, the orange is center, and the red is right. And in our placement taxonomy, you can describe things as just left, center, or right. And what left means is you didn't really want to get more specific, or your anthology didn't want you to get more specific, but the thing is somewhere on the left. The center is kind of the same. I don't think we have anything more specific for center, but it's just in the center somewhere. And then the right, anything on the right, it could be in the text block, it could be in the margin, it could be in the top or the bottom formwork areas, but it's somewhere on the right of the page. So you can just say it's on the right. So all of these things here that are in red could be described with our value PLC right. And that's fine, it's accurate, it's on the right. Or you can get more specific. So this thing in the top formworks area, that's PLC right top. This is our PLC right adjacent. That's a really fun one. We had a blast kind of coming up with what to do with these things, because we have a few stage directions, actually a couple of speeches in Hamlet, Q2, where there's something, it's on the right, it's multiple lines, it's just kind of floating beside the speech, but it's not in the margin, it's in the text block itself. And the styling for that, we have to give something more specific if we want it to look like how it looks in the early modern playbook. And so we've given it this PLC right adjacent so that we can make it look like this. This we've got right inline, and this I think is where the most confusion comes up, because we have 2 types of things that can be right inline. You'll see that this exeunt here isn't in line with anything else. It's in its own line, but it is, you know, a sensical compositorial line. And so we can say it's PLC right inline because clearly it's on a sensical line. This exeunt down here is also right inline. It's still on a compositorial line. It happens to share this one with a line and a speech, but it is on a compositorial line. And so both of these things are right inline because they are on a compositorial line. We have PLC right above. It's for manuscripts. And that's when we've got, you know, this little word that somebody forgot in here, drew an arrow to point it in, but they happen to put the word off to the right. This is right above. It's not on a compositorial line. It's kind of floating between these two. So we couldn't say that it's right in line. We can say that it's right above, or we could say that it's just on the right. When we use these more specific things like right above, right adjacent, right top, we get the opportunity to give it more specific styling. So for some anthologies, it really matters capturing kind of these more precise things of where they are. For some, it doesn't matter so much, but it will, you know, make a difference if you put PLC right instead of PLC right adjacent. You're going to get an extra line of white space here because that's all that we can really do with the styling.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
What does PLC stand for?
It stands for place. And the reason that we have it there in front of everything is we had an old placement taxonomy that just didn't kind of meet our needs. It was fairly basic. I think we had left, right, center or something like that. And we had Mihaela and I and 2 other people, I believe, a few years ago. Mihaela was working on a project with stage directions, and we were all working on semi-diplomatic transcriptions. And we were just finding that what we had didn't accurately describe all of the things that we were seeing, which were really, really varied. And then we came across a few places where we had this happening. There was a stage direction or a speech off to the side. It was taking up multiple lines, and we had no way to indicate that that was what was happening. And so we spent a summer kind of coming up with these, and we had to replace the old things with the new things, and we needed something to make them clearly different from each other. And so we just added this little prefix of PLC, which is the whole history of how that happened. But I think it's good to know that that's how that was created. Of course, we can have things in the margin, PLC right margin, that's over here, and then right bottom would be down in the formworks. And again, all of these could be described as PLC right, but you can also get more specific. The nice thing about using Oxygen for a TEI is as you type place equals, you're going to get a drop down with all of these. And you can just start typing and it will fill in what it thinks you're probably looking for. It's really quick and easy. I personally find it doesn't take much more time or effort to put right in line than it does to put right. So, you know, it's not too bad to get that more specific. Left and center are a little bit less involved just because we have less going on there because the text is aligned that direction. You know, so where we could have, you know, things that span multiple lines besides something else on the right side of the page, we can't really have that on the left. But we do have left top, which is in the top, left margin, left inline, which is the same as right. It could be on its own line like this is, as long as it's in a logical compositorial line, that's inline, or it could be to the left of something else. That's also left inline as long as it's in that compositorial line. We can have a PLC left above, which is a little bit awkward to put, but you know, it's something that somebody forgot. They drew an arrow to say, oh, the I should go before am, and they just put the I off on the left. That's our PLC left above. And again, that's for manuscripts. I believe we also have a bottom when it's just below. It's the same thing. It's not in a compositorial line. It's either above the line or below the line that it belongs with. And all of these could be described as PLC left, or you can use these more specific things. Center, there isn't anything really special about center. It's got top, it's got bottom, center top, center bottom, and then there's PLC center. And we can use PLC center if it's on the same line as something else, or if it's on its own line. If it's just like, a character after a line of speech, we can use PLC inline as well. And that just says it's in line. It's not really right. It's not really center. It just comes after whatever text is there. Great. And that's my little guide to our placement taxonomy. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay. Any questions before I move on too far from here? All right, I'll keep going. And if you think of them, stick them in the chat or ask them. And so those are our preform values. Our style itself for the place attribute comes from our Sass file. So in that underscore semidip.scss, I've written a big section on what to do when the processor comes across the place attribute. And so you're describing with your TEI by saying PLC right inline. And then our Sass says, I see the word PLC right inline. I'm going to come and put this thing on the right side of the page. And I see something's come in on the chat. Is that a question we've got?
Yeah, it's a comment about right inline being a little unreliable in the past from.
Yeah. So yeah, because Lean, you've been working while we've been developing these things. So you've gotten to see the work in progress, which you'll still see a little bit right now, for the next couple of weeks, I expect. But everything should just go to the right now. And where there are bugs, please report them, because that's something that we've missed usually. Which we don't want to do. We want to cover all of our bases. All right. And this is what place looks like. Pretty standard. We've got a stage, it's an entrance, and it is on the center. So we've given it place equals PLC center. Style, it also applies to a single element. It can go on any element, much like rendition can. And it allows complex and really specific CSS. We're going to talk a lot more about how to deal with this in August, but I love the style attribute. I think it's really fun. You get to practice your CSS skills, but it does require some knowledge of CSS. But it lets you do what you like and makes overriding things pretty easy, really, when it comes down to it, compared with things like rendition or the tags decal. So some syntax for writing our CSS in our tags decal, and then eventually in our style. The first thing that we talk about is selectors. So our selector is the thing that tells the processor what element we want to style. And in our CSS or our SCSS file, our selectors are in HTML, and in our tags decal, they're in TEI. Which means that when I go back and forth, sometimes I get confused and mix them up. But TEI is what really you guys need to worry about. So to create them in your tags decal, it's pretty straightforward. You find what you want to style. Here we've got a label where type equals heading. We have a really good title here. And then you're going to write out your element label. You don't need any brackets or anything. It just is label. Add your attribute in square brackets. We've got type. And then add your value in straight apostrophes. So label, square bracket, type equals, heading in straight apostrophes, and then close that square bracket. That's your selector. So in that tags decal we looked at earlier, there is a selector attribute. This is what would go in there. And then adding style. This is where we actually get in and get to look at CSS and styling. We've got our properties, and they function similarly to attributes. So if you're thinking coming over from your encoding brain to your CSS brain, our properties are like a category of adjective. So things like, you know, your font color, or your font family, or your text alignment. That's what these are. And they follow US American spelling. Center is CENTER when we get into center, and stuff like that. Just something to keep in mind. And for our syntax, properties are always followed by a colon. So that includes things like color. You'll notice the American spelling, no U. Font style. Is it italicized? Is it bold? Is it, what is it? Text align, left, right, center, font family, and so on. And then we have our values, and they function similarly to how CEI values function. They're the specific adjective. They're what you want. We always, always, always follow our values with a semicolon. And when you have multiple values, they each get separated. Or when you have multiple selectors, the last value always gets, you know, followed by a semicolon. Which I don't have any examples of, but, you know, red semicolon is a selector. And then our declaration, what we call our declaration, is the property and the value just put together. So this is a declaration. We have our font style colon, our value is italic semicolon, and it says this bit of text should be italicized. So if we put it together, we've got our selector, we've got our declaration. No, I've lost a slide. We will have something that looks like, I'm going to go back up here. We'll have something that looks like this. So we've got our rendition element. We have our selector attribute, and here's our selector. So again, here's our element, FW. We know that our attributes are in square brackets, and that attribute is type. And then our value is in those square apostrophes. It's running title. Then we have our declaration here. So we've said that the text align should be centered. And notice we've got our colon and our semicolon. Then we've got a second declaration that says our font style should be italic. And then we've said that it displays blocks, so it takes up its own space vertically on the page. All right. So to kind of, you know, push together all of the things that we just went over in a nice little recap, we've talked about CSS and SCSS, where CSS is our cascading style sheets. It styles the HTML, and it's based on cascade and also specificity. So things are going from the big file down to the little file, and the little file is overriding the big file. Our SCSS is our syntactically awesome cascading style sheet, and it just allows for nesting. We talked about our principles, which is meant to follow endings compliance. So if something's not somehow described on the page, it must be styled also on the page. And we are trying to mimic, not exactly recreate early modern pages. The example that I kind of will give about that is for things that are in the left margin in your early modern playbook. On the website, even though you've put that their place is PLC left margin, they're going to appear in the right margin. And that's just because that's where we have space on our websites. And so that was a decision that we made a while ago And so it's not going to exactly look the exact same, but it will look reasonably similar. We have our 3 levels of style. The first is our SCSS. That's our generic style. It applies to everybody, semi-diplomatic transcriptions. Then we have our file-wide style. It's our tags decal element, which uses CSS selectors and declarations, and that applies just to your file. And you get to change that up as you see fit. And then we have our inline style with the rendition attribute, which applies to a whole element and uses preformed values from our renditions taxonomy. We have place attribute, which applies to stage directions and also can apply to labels, and also uses preformed values, which we just looked at. And we have the style attribute, which also applies to any whole element and uses CSS declarations, which you get to write yourself. We looked at our syntax, where in our HTML we have, or sorry, in everything we have our selector, and then we have our property and our value. So for example, we could have a span data L equals stage or margin equals 0. And this is an example using our HTML because it doesn't have that selector element, which we need in our TEI tags decal. But it works the same. There's a selector, there's a value, or there's a declaration. We do have some resources about all of this. The first is our Alemdo documentation. We've got 4 things here. I actually added a 5th, which must have downloaded the wrong version to this computer, but we have some things in chapter 12 that are about style. So style and semi-diplomatic transcriptions, our default style, file-wide style, inline style. We also have in chapter 3, that placement taxonomy. That's a really good reference to go back to, pull open those pages and look at where left is, where left inline is, where right inline is, and get to see them in action, as well as read through definitions in English or in French if that's your preference. There are also external resources. So MDN is a big one. It's where I like to go if I have a specific question about CSS. W3 Schools has a good tutorial on CSS, which I've worked through bits and pieces of, and can be helpful for getting a bit of practice in. I've also given a link to that set of slides with the placement taxonomy just here. And before I end, I would like to say thank you to a few people and groups. The first is SSHRC for funding this webinar series. Thank you, SSHRC. We really appreciate it. Thank you to me for designing some slides or template slides. Thanks to Martin Holmes for our TEI customization. And thanks to HCMC for our site design and hosting.